talking with you, the network section.
All right. Yeah, let's get started. I have a lot to talk through, and I'm originally from New Jersey, so I talk a little quickly. You're going to see a bunch of walls of text. Don't worry. There's a thing you can download after. It's LLMs. There's going to be a lot of text. There's really no way around that. But my name's Alec Lazarescu. I've been working in the education industry most of my career, but the AI stuff has always been kind of an outside of work passion as well as inside of work. So I found some interesting things about how we can work together with AI models. And who's heard of like the rubber duck principle, like you talk to a rubber duck? Awesome. Yeah, so for those that haven't, just the way you can go through and put together your thoughts, explain it. Sometimes you find that you actually figured out the issue or solved it. And the fun part about doing this with a language model is it talks back. So you may figure out just explaining it, but you may actually get feedback and get some interesting results back. So we're going to go through, talk about what information you should provide to a language model. And I say language model in particular, I typically use Claude Sonnet 3.5. ChatGPT works well as well. So you want a decent, powerful model to do this on, but you do have some choices there. And we're going to look at how we do a bit of a back and forth dialogue, some interesting tips on how to do that. And we're going to start with the high-level architecture, run through that a little bit, and then go to the code. And the reason we do that is because if you just ask it to write a bunch of code, you're going to pay a bunch of money for all those tokens. You're going to wait while they all kind of slowly drill down. And inevitably, you'll find out like, oh, I didn't want it to do that, or oh, I meant something else. So it's much easier to have it do a plan with you and then get to the code after you agree on the plan. And a lot of these things kind of sound similar to working with people. So it's a little bit of a weird time now. We're kind of anthropomorphizing these AI tools because they are based on language. But just things to keep in mind. If you couldn't explain it to a person, don't expect great results from the model. So one thing you can think of it is the AI model can act as your editor. And I don't mean like an editor like, oh, you have a typo, you have a grammar mistake. It's more like a development editor, where it's someone who like really understands your story, your character arcs, all of those things. And then it can give you advice if you're being inconsistent or you're missing something or they have some ideas. That's kind of how we're going to be collaborating on the high-level design. So we're not going deep. We're not asking it like, write this one method for me. We're kind of going a bit higher level. And you could do this right at the beginning, ask it to create an architecture plan based on some information you give it, or you could give it an existing plan that you have, whether it's in production or proposal. Like either way, you can still get some value out of it. The context is super important. So imagine you're hiring someone new who's going to be a software architect. Not every company is the same. There's the favorite answer of like, how do you do this? Like, well, it depends. And there's a reason for that, because there's different needs each company has, different industries they're in. It's not just write me this and it'll work everywhere for every purpose. So it's not so much that there's a lot of wrong answers, but there's ways to get something that's a good fit for you, and you can provide context to the model to get a better chance at that. And it'll let you converge faster on something useful if you do that up front, versus sort of go back and forth, getting like not something you need and slowly kind of knocking pieces into place. After you put in a context, you describe what you want to build. This is something you can vary in terms of how long it is. We're going to do a very quick, simple example and show how it might work. But really, the project plan and the context is setting the stage, and that I can give some advice on. What you want to build is obviously totally customized to your circumstance. And as you go through talking with the model, the thing I do is I ask it to ask me questions. Like you'll see I end with like, ask up to 5 clarifying questions. So instead of just it going off on itself and it going, oh, maybe you want to do this, or I'm going to take this approach, it can right away put some questions back at you. You'll answer them and get it in the right direction much more efficiently. You can ask for reasons, like why did it choose something? Sometimes it'll find out that it made a mistake based on some clarification. Other times you may find out that, oh, you know what, this is actually a better approach. And you can even open like a separate window, go like a little learning side quest. If there's something it tells you about that you haven't used before, you can poke at it a bit, learn a bit more about the technology, get some references to read. I find I sometimes jump out to like a Perplexity Pro instead of ChatGPT because it also like integrates the web and gets a really good source material, including like things you can click through for details. And this last part is where it gets like a little bit fun and different than what you'd expect. So we have people at our company sometimes that challenge us, and this can be in positive ways, or it could just be kind of a little combative in meetings. But we'll just say, like, let's say there's this person, Bob, at your company, and he's been there a long time, super experienced, does a great job, but he's really, really like not interested in like doing new things. It's like, well, we've done this way for years. Like, why are we adding complexity? Why are we kind of doing all these services and interconnection points? This seems like a bad idea. Like, I don't get it. You can actually craft a persona, have the AI almost like role play this persona interacting with your design or its own design, and what it would say to them. So this is kind of a bit meta because you've got AI playing a character talking to itself, but it's really useful because you can see what arguments you may get from people like this at your company, or just get an idea of how to be prepared and maybe adjust your design for the better. And you can make a stronger case, and it's almost like a mock debate you can practice for. And you can add a lot more personas. You can add a business person, you can add a CSO, a CIO. All of these are useful to just identify any weaknesses, things you maybe have not considered, or maybe things you did, but this lets you crisp your answer a little bit better. A little tip here, if you can use mermaid declarative diagrams, that works really well with both these models, the ChatGPT and the Claude Sonnet. And I'll show an example of what they look like, but instead of having like an image or a kind of a hand-drawn diagram, you basically put like a text-based format to describe whether it's a UML sequence diagram, a flowchart, whatever you want to do. And that's very easy for the models to understand and create for you. Or if you paste it in, it'll understand what you're looking at. And you can kind of round trip this thing between tweaks you make or tweaks the AI makes. And I like it because you can literally put it into like GitHub in your README Markdown file. It'll render inside of GitHub. If you pop it in tools like Confluence, there's a little macro, it'll render in Confluence. So you can kind of take these diagrams everywhere. And if someone's making code changes, they can update these. And you see in your code review, literally like this line changed, like, oh, they added a call from this service to that service. So really super helpful. And it's even better when working with these AI models. So just to kind of reiterate, we're going to get to some demos soon, but this is a great way to use an AI model to get early feedback. You can understand what concerns might be raised. You can get new ideas, new approaches, and you can test versions quickly. So you can get rapid iteration, and you can be ready like ahead of presenting to real people. Like this is not a substitute for like, oh, I'm just going to talk to the AI and I'm going to go build this and like I'm not going to talk to my team. But what this lets you do is get a refined version of things before you talk to people. I don't know if you've seen at your company, but places I've worked, it's become much more scheduled. It wasn't like it used to be where I just walk over to someone's office or I walk over to where the team sits and like, oh, I see they're not super busy. We'll just chat about something. Like I got to put a calendar invite. And I'm working with people in different time zones, different offices. So by the time I get to talk to someone, it might be a while. And if I could have some at least simulated feedback, it at least gets me thinking. Again, this is feedback. This is not the AI model is going to do my job and I just sort of like paste it in email and like go fishing. But this is something that will help you really get some additional insight and like clarify your own thinking by using it. So I'm going to start showing a couple things. Again, there's going to be a wall of text. There'll be a link to it, but it'll give you an idea of the type of things we can do. So the first thing is what I call the project classification. So I'll just highlight a few things. You'll see when you look at the examples later, like the full thing. But it helps to set the stage for what are you doing for this architecture? What is your goal? Are you doing this to get ready something right for production? Are you learning a new technology you want to share with your team? There's a big difference between making a POC where the focus is kind of readability and like having it easy for someone to run, and making something like production ready where it's got to be scalable, secure, all these other things that if you threw this in front of a new person just to like demo something, it'll be super confusing and a pain to run. So you gotta set that context to get something back that's fitting what you want. I also like to tell it, where do I kind of tend to go with my group? Like, do I want to build an initial system that's simpler but can expand later, or do I want to kind of do more out of the gate? Depends what your customers are looking for. Are you making an MVP, or are you for sure building something for like telecom scale? Like, we know it's got to be 5 nines. Like there's no like if, ands, or buts about it. What's the load it needs to handle? I just gave it simple orders of magnitude here. So what you do is you essentially use a template like this, just pick an answer from each of the categories and make that as part of your project's context. SLA requirements, again, if you have 5 nines, you're going to have a much different, much more expensive architecture than if you have 3 nines. So the model needs to know these things to do something out of the gate that's closer to what you'd be looking for. Data loss tolerance. If you ask someone like, are you okay with losing data? The answer is no. Okay. But there is nuance to that. It costs a lot of money to add just a little bit more data tolerance. If you think about like if you're failing over to another region, if you can't have any data loss, like what's that mean? Well, that means you're probably using synchronous replication. It probably means you're a bit slower, you're spending more money. And when you tell people like, oh, that'll cost 5 times more, they're like, no, you know what, like 2 minutes is good, I'm good. So we'll jump to the organization template. So that was like the particular project. There's probably things about your organization that would be good context to add. You can definitely make your own. This is just an example. I did something simple where it's like a level 1, 2, and 3. Like how is your team's cloud capability? Like, are they used to just working in applications and having like a managed deployment system? Like in the past, it would be like Heroku style, or just push the code somewhere, auto deploys, and they don't worry too much about it. Are they somewhere in between? They're kind of aware of containerization and kind of a bit more advanced things. Or are they cloud native experts? Are they building their own platforms and patterns in the cloud for what you're putting together? You'll have different answers based on those. Do you have any approved languages or technologies where, you know what, like we focus on Java and Python, and if you want to do something else, you got to go to some approval board. Like some people work in that place, so you might as well tell the model up front versus it going off and doing something and later like, no, actually we can't do that. Are there any disallowed technologies? Sometimes they're disallowed for regulatory reasons. Sometimes the boss had a bad experience and now no one can use it. Like whatever it might be, put it in, give it to the model. Any sort of compliance, data protection, integration standards. If you use Auth0 and you want the model to do that, if you use Stripe payments, like whatever you got in there, add it in there. So here's an example of what I was talking about for the project. So you'd go through the categories, and in your prompt, you just pick and copy it. And I didn't just copy production-ready architecture. I copied the little blurb that has a bit of detail on that, because that's what like makes sure you and the model agree on like what you mean by that. I did 100 TPS, 4 nines. zero data loss, and level 2. And this is what we do here: Java, React, Postgres. We don't like these things for whatever reasons. We have these requirements. And now how do I use that in a prompt? So I take my sample context, which is both the project and your organization one, and I kind of use it like a template variable. And I start this off like, you're an AWS solutions architect aiming to create a cloud software architecture design for a given feature. Here's the context. And I put one sentence here. I want to design a patient scheduling system, just for an example. You can put as much as you like. And then I end with this part, which is important. First of all, I tell it we're not writing any code on the stage. We're just focusing on agreeing on a design. That way it doesn't start like spinning out a bunch of files before you like understand what it's doing and why. And I ask it for a few things. I ask it for a high-level architecture, which services are suitable. I put in AWS here. You can put in whatever you want. I told it about the diagrams in that mermaid syntax, which I'll show in a little bit. Ask it about deployments and what to detail. And then I say, ask up to 5 clarifying questions before starting. And before it does anything, it gives me a bunch of questions. And they're usually pretty decent questions that are useful for kind of guiding it. So I'll go through the rest of these kind of little prompt starters, and then I'll show like the actual like conversations, and you can kind of see how it plays out. So the critique persona, like the first one we talked about, like we just called this person Bob, highly wary of new technology over the complex designs. Create a fictitious devil's advocate response for them upon seeing this design and some of the questions they've raised. For each point, determine whether criticism is valid and a better approach exists, or you can justify the existing design. So we are not saying Bob runs the company. We're not saying Bob is always right or wrong. We're asking it to make some sort of judgment to the degree, whatever degree this model can, and provide justification. And the justification is important because if it just says like yes, no, no, yes, like what do you do with that? You can follow the justification and like see if you agree or not. And it wrote this in the form of like a pretend email, which I thought was kind of fun. It says, why are we using Fargate instead of plain EC2? We already know how to manage EC2. And the model, this is the model responding to the fictitious email. So this is why it gets kind of meta. It says, this criticism has merit, but is only partially valid. So it talks about Fargate eliminates capacity planning. It doesn't really cost more. And it has like a lot of managed features. And then Bob was like, oh, this was a different example. Like it was like a reporting system. And it was like WebSockets for report completion, that's overkill. Why not just have the browser poll? And in this case, the model is like, you know what, that's valid. Simple polling is fine for the type of reporting to do. I'll update the design. Why Redis? Just for session state. Like, you know what, it's not a busy app. We can just throw it in Postgres. So it kind of goes through and like you can agree or disagree. It can adjust the design for you. But at least you kind of heard and have things to think about. Critique persona 2, I put like a CIO for security, looking for compliance gaps and disaster recovery business continuity posture. And it said, this doesn't invalidate earlier constraints, but should be considered alongside them. And it says, your design shows no encryption strategy. Most people's POC designs don't always put that in, even though we typically do it. But it doesn't hurt to like throw it in. So the system goes, you know what, you're right. I'll add RDS encryption. I'll add this and that. I see no audit trails. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, we should probably add that. So you can see how this approach can be pretty interesting to get more information about what people may expect. And you may decide like, you know what, that's like TMI or TBD. Like I don't want to make a 30-page presentation. But at least you have like an answer ready. Like if someone brings it up, you have something that you've thought about, so you're not kind of caught off guard. And this last one was fun, so I made it like a business persona, where it's someone who's always talking with customers. Maybe they're in sales or marketing, maybe they're the CEO of a startup, and they're sponsoring the project, but they're concerned about the cost and timeline, and like what is the customer value. And this part in yellow, I added in because the model started telling this person like, oh, this part will be phase 1 done in 3 weeks. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, what are you doing? This model's like promising on behalf of teams on some high level design. Like, no. So I added this so that it didn't even like give nonsense like that. And then it goes through for each step and like, what do we do? Explains it in kind of more simple terms. What's the business value of it? And even like a customer message, like we can generate reports simultaneously without impacting performance. Like that's why we're doing this upgrade for you. We're adding more reliability. We're using auto scaling so that it's more cost efficient, so it doesn't cost as much to run, but when you need it, it'll be there. Like all these things are in here. So handy stuff. And I'll write the last prompt here, and then I'll show the mermaid diagrams and some example conversations. So let's say we went back and forth this model. We got a plan that we agree on, and we wanted to write some sample code. Again, this is sample code. It's not like guaranteed to run, but I give it a bit of a preamble. You're a senior DevOps engineer, you're a solutions architect, create a CDK v2 TypeScript project to implement this architecture plan. That's kind of a mouthful, but so CDK is just a deployment framework on Amazon that lets you do infrastructure as code, and it's a nice way to deploy things because instead of clicking around the console and making things, it'll create it for you, it'll destroy it, it'll update it. It could be a little challenging to learn sometimes. I found this a great way to kind of teach people like the general idea of it. And if you create it with the AI model, it can often be faster and easier to just do this automation than have someone click it manually like, oh, they did it on the dev site, they did it on this other site. Like by the time you're done, like, you know, we probably should automate it in the first place. And then you can include your general guidelines. I put just one. Clearly, you can put a bunch more. I find I have to tell it this every time, like create a list of constants at the top of files rather than magic strings strewn within them. This thing seems to love like just putting things in strings, and I want to see what I can configure. You could tell it create an env file, like whatever is kind of your typical practices. I have like long ones that I customize based on what I'm doing. Then you paste in the plan, and I put in some example follow-up questions. Like this thing just started rolling. I'm like, hold on. What's the folder structure? Like, where are all these files supposed to live? And another follow-up. Okay, this thing's like giving me a permission error. Add some instructions for creating the IAM user and get that going. So I'll switch over to the example. So this is a conversation with Claude Sonnet 3.5. And you can see I have my little preamble here. I pasted in the project classification that I showed. And at the end, ask up to 5 clarifying questions. And it asks me some questions. What are our main personas? Patients, healthcare providers, admin staff. Any integration requirements? What's data retention policy? Performance requirements? Do you need real-time notifications? Like, oh, these are pretty good questions. So I gave it answers to all of them. And then it created a high-level diagram. And we can pop this up. And we can see this is in that mermaid format, where it's a flow chart. It's got some subgraphs. And it's got all these connection points. If you're not familiar with this, it could be kind of a pain to create. But once it's there, it's pretty easy to tweak. Like if you're like, oh, I just want to add one more line here, one more service, it's much easier to just add on than make these from scratch. And when you preview it, you can actually see what this looks like. And this will actually render nicely in GitHub. It goes on, talks about key components for the front end, what it thinks it should do, CloudFront and S3, WAF, an API gateway, ECS Fargate. So it goes on and on. I'll show another example. So this was the report generation one. And this was where I gave it a little bit more free-flowing stuff before I had a template. But I covered some of the same things like, oh, we're just 6 people, we're working Java and Python, we use Datadog, aim for production ready, this is how many reports we're doing. Then I continue with not writing any code at this stage and the rest of it. Asking me my 5 questions. It makes a sequence diagram. So you can see what's happening here. It's checking a cache in Redis. So pretty handy way to explain things. I ask a follow-up, like, how is the browser notified for long-running reports? CloudFormation's hard for us. Is there something easier? And it goes and talks about, okay, let's do this with WebSockets. It even starts writing code, even though I told it not to. Sometimes these things don't listen.
They don't have the best memory.
Right. They also don't have the best memory. That's another reason why you want to get as much up front. Because if you keep going back and forth, by the time you're done, it forgot something you already told it, and it's frustrating. So it talks about there's like a WebSocket or a server-sent events approach. This is where I would go on a side quest and like, oh, what's the difference between WebSocket and server-sent events? Let me open another window and like learn about that. And here I put the personas, like it's reviewed by the CIO and what it wrote back. And back to that mermaid chart. So if you go to mermaid.live, you can paste that in and see the rendering. And you can just edit this and it starts syncing up to it. So very neat way to show things. So running close to time now, so I'll just pop back to the final slide. So I got a QR code, also got a link, botsinai.com/126.html. That's today's date, 12/6. So I have a link to that document where I show the prompts and other things you can look at. You can take a look at that. This is very much something for you to customize. It's a good start, but it's something you can look at. And I also run meetup events. I've been doing events since, I don't know, 2016. So ran quite a lot of events, educational events. So if you're interested in more AI talks, I have people from other companies talk. Sometimes I talk. Definitely check it out. We have a talk on December 17th also about AI and making your developers leaders at every level.
Is it here in the Metro?
It's online.
Oh, it's online.
So it's everywhere.
Oh, okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So you mentioned some of the memory issues that it has where it forgets some commands. At what point, I know sometimes when I start going back and forth, I love Claude, much better than ChatGPT. But after a while, the conversation starts going in the wrong direction. You kind of just start over.
Right.
How do you know when you start getting less usefulness from that one session and it's time to move to a different session? And how do you bring over what usefulness from the previous context over?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no hard and fast rule because they keep changing these models, and they do a combination of sending a lot of stuff versus some summarizing, and the summarizing is hit or miss on their back end. So if I find I've got like a neat diagram and enough context, I will sometimes pop the instructions and the diagram into a new window and then start iterating there. I ask it, summarize this, create a document that explains your design philosophy, and then I can just pop all those over to a new spot and try again. And the nice thing about having these documents is you can give them your developers. I find writing documentation is much easier where I have a head start or rough draft. I can show it a bunch of things, create the documentation, or if I start a design directly, it has it from the start. And you get much better like next steps on it by having some documentation for about the reasons why you did things and what the components are and all of that. Yeah.
Have you started using the projects in Claude with the team? I haven't.
I've used it a little bit. I haven't yet found the breaking points of those. It seems to tell you it'll do more, but yeah, it's definitely something to experiment with further. I haven't got a lot of experience. I tried one quick thing with it. All right, thanks everyone.